All right, Emily, welcome to the Easy Conversations podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm really excited about what we're going to discuss. It's a very important topic given the current social situations we're in and the access to technology we all have, including our children. But before we jump into it, I do want to give you an opportunity to share with the listeners a little bit about yourself and what's brought you here and what's the work you're doing.
Yes, thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here. So my name is Emily Churkin. I'm a former middle school teacher at 12 years in the classroom working with seventh graders, teaching English. I loved being a teacher. I'm also a parent, so I have a 16 and a 13-year-old myself. So I very much am in the thick of this as a parent.
Yeah.
And then one of the things I noticed when I was in the classroom was two things happening. One, my students were going home and logging on to the social media platforms of the day, which of course was like Facebook at the time.
Mhm.
And they were coming to class the next day talking about things they'd seen, things they'd been left out of, how y- you name it, from silly cat videos to really terrible, dumb stuff. And so what I noticed was like all of this social chatter became about that. And it was really impacting in-class relationships. And at the same time, as a teacher, I was increasingly being asked to do more digital tech for teaching. So
Mm,
online grade books, posting assignment, which I didn't like because one of my favorite things as a teacher was walk around the room. I had my planner, my grade book. I could just check things off. I could talk one-on-one. And
mhm,
so what happened is it drove students away from talking to me directly, which I saw as an important skill, and encouraged parents who now had access to the platforms to email me.
mm,
So what I saw as really important skill building suddenly became parents emailing me. I'm spending more time in front of my computer to deal with parents. Kids aren't coming to me as often, plus all the social fallout from social media. That
mm.
was even before kids were really having their own devices. Because at that point, I don't know, that was 10 years ago, 12 years ago, and there were maybe half the kids had devices. It really wasn't the majority yet. But by the time I left the classroom, 95% of my students had smartphones, and that was in 2015. So we obviously know that number is higher.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, for sure. And so what I'm always curious when people come on here and they've done some sort of pivot in their life and they're trying to serve the community, and that community can look like it could be in different shapes and forms. Right? So I'm always curious to understand what allowed you to want to make a change. And I can sense what was going on, but I just want to understand that a little bit better.
Yeah. I realized I couldn't talk about the vocabulary list when the kids were completely distracted by the I hate so and so Facebook group that got created the night before. Their part of it is understanding development and knowing that this age group in particular is social connection is so important. We're all human and social connection is important for all of us, but particularly in those middle school years when we're doing that, who am I? Who do I want to be? What kind of person am I? Social, both the collateral and capital of it has a huge impact on their psyches and experiences. And it was obvious to me. I'm not going to get through with vocab today if we don't sit and have a conversation about it. And what I found was actually really powerful was as soon as I started talking to my students about it, at first I was doing the you really should be nice online and you should be careful what you write. This was like early Facebook days. It was new to all of us.
Right.
And, in addition, they were also starting to friend me, and there were no parameters around like teacher, student, online stuff, which, as you can imagine, red flags everywhere. So there was no precedent. And I remember very distinctly my students being like, well, okay, but yeah, you're telling us to stop, but you know what? It's our parents. Our parents are texting and driving. Our parents are playing Candy Crush. Our parents are scrolling through Facebook. And I was like, "Oh," and so my aha moment was, this isn't a kid problem. This is an adult problem that's impacting children.
Mhm,
And as much as I loved working with kids and I miss it, I realized that in order to have a bigger impact, I actually needed to get to the parents
mhm,
who were making the decisions to purchase the devices. And I know we spoke briefly about this before we recorded, but I'm very conscientious. I always say this to parents, it is not your fault that things are where they are, but it is your responsibility to understand the problem. And it's okay to say I made a mistake or I wish I hadn't done X, Y, or Z. No parent has ever come to me and said, gosh, I wish I gave my kid a phone sooner, or I wish I'd introduced them to social media younger. Never. It's always the opposite. That requires a lot of parent work too, right?
Yes.
Humility and owning up to the fact that we're still learning as well. But I think there is a huge responsibility there for us. And that doesn't mean it's easy.
No, no, absolutely. And there's one crucial thing that you did touch on it and you talked about as well was this social development piece. And I think that's become such a huge issue, not only for children, but I think children are obviously being impacted the most, but even adults, right? So I do want
Yes.
to touch on a few things, whether it's online dating, whether it's video games, whether it's social media use, everyone's being impacted. And then COVID didn't help with that because everyone was
Exactly.
devices. And we haven't really come out of that and figured out a way to how to actually socially interact with people.
Yeah.
One of the things you were alluding to was the children were no longer having that face-to-face conversation, which is
Yes.
so rare nowadays. And if you don't learn that at an early age, then you're going to
Hmm.
struggle. And you can see some people get very nervous and uncomfortable in those situations. The funny thing is, even in the Western world, I was listening to another podcast where the individual was talking about when you're in an elevator, people get so
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
rigid, right? And
The social norms, right?
yeah, so it's tough for people to have those conversations as it is, and
Yes.
now become even more difficult. And then if you're not learning that at that age, as you mentioned, it's going to impact their future in terms of how they communicate with others.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I'm talking about adolescence, but actually these behaviors start in technically in utero. But if you think about infancy and parental child communication, obviously your newborn isn't going to speak with you, but they are communicating. And when a parent is holding a phone and a baby, and there's a triangulation of the attention, right? A baby knows that you're not looking at them. And what babies need is that eye communication, eye
Mhm.
contact, repetition of sounds. That's how children are learning the skills of communication. And when we interfere with that experience because of tech, we are seeing delays in communication skills. And I love talking to OTs and PTs who do work on these developmental stages with children. And they're saying this to me that kids are hitting milestones much later. We're seeing an uptick in autism diagnoses. I had an OT tell me she used to work with kids on handwriting, and now she's working on teaching them how to turn the pages of a book, which I mean, it's mind boggling to think about that that's a skill that we teach children, but that they're not even having those experiences in their early childhood. And
Mhm.
I am not a, I don't want to come across as completely alarmist either, because as I say over and over again, I'm not anti tech, I am tech intentional. And I think there is a time and a place to use it as a tool, as a communication device, and for entertainment. There are ways in which it makes our lives more convenient. But one of the challenges I see, particularly with young children whose brains aren't fully developed, is this concept of friction. I've been thinking about this a lot lately, that tech claims to make our lives easier. And in many ways, it does. But easier doesn't mean better learning. In fact, when we want to learn something new, we need to struggle. We need to have hurdles. We need to work just past our comfort level. And so when we take that away in the name of efficiency or this better, we deprive someone of that learning opportunity. And so I see that as problematic from the skill side for parenting and children, but also on the education
Yeah.
side with the tech that's coming in through schools. So I'm a big fan of friction.
No, absolutely. That's the work that Carol Dweck did, and when she was talking
Yes.
about growth mindset is to be able to overcome those challenges is where you actually learn the most and how you maintain that growth mindset. And I do see that
Yes.
as well with children, right? I see it with my son. He'll get bored easily, so then he needs a device
Yes.
to keep himself occupied. And I often
Yes.
reflect on my childhood when we went on road trips. We had to come up with like random
Yeah.
games to occupy
Yeah.
ourselves, but there's that friction again, right? Being in that discomfort and figuring out a way to
Yes.
work through it. And what I'm hearing from you, and I can make that connection as well, because I see that as a therapist too, is if you're not building those resiliency skills early
Yes.
in life, then that's going to
Yes.
impact your mental health as you become an adult as well.
That's exactly it. And like you pointed out earlier, adults are reaching for devices to self-soothe or distract or hide from facing something uncomfortable because it's easy. It's just so easy to do that. Why would we not? It's like our brain wants the easiest option. And yet to consciously resist that is so difficult for adults. And again, we've got fully formed brains. It's That's one thing I say to parents all the time. I'm sure we're all guilty of the doom scroll at night or the multiple episodes in a row and we only intended to do just one. If it's hurt for us and our brains are fully developed, how on earth can we expect
Mm,
children to manage this? We
mm.
shouldn't because developmentally they can't. It's and to your point about childhood and boredom, boredom is an opportunity. Boredom is good. Boredom is the birthplace of creativity. And it doesn't mean you can't be creative on tech, but you have to have these skills first of knowing how to be creative before you hand over a device that kind of does it for you, right? Again, that friction piece. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I hear you for sure. And I think we've talked about some of the issues, and there's a lot there too, where you'll often walk into a restaurant, again, not shaming or judging people, but
Yeah.
see children on their phones. So again, that social interaction is not happening, even though you're having dinner together.
Right.
So there's a lot of,
Right.
so what are some things parents can do to help with this
Yeah.
and understand some of the risks as well? Um, just to start focusing on that as well in terms of
Yeah.
there.
Yeah. And again, I always tell parents replace judgment with curiosity. I joke that parenting is the judgiest sport I've ever played. It doesn't matter what you do, someone's going to have an opinion about it that's contrary to what you think is best. And this is one of the challenges of digital tech is that there isn't a one size fits all solution that works for every family. I really take the belief or take the approach that we focus on our values, right? What is it that is important in our family? And that could be anything. There's a whole range of what's important to different families. And that's part of it. The other part, again, is like parents have an opportunity to learn about this. Like the fact that my kid is having trouble getting off a device has is not because they're weak-willed, it's not because they're bad, it's because their neural pathways are being hijacked by manipulative design techniques.
Mhm.
And parents need to understand that that's intentional, that the companies hire developmental psychologists to make their products addictive. And so I always say it's not a fair fight. You're not fighting your kid, you're fighting a hijacked neural pathway. And so to de-escalate the conflict, and I'll phrase it in a different way. I get asked two questions all the time. How much screen time is too much? And what parental controls do you recommend? And I'm going to say that those are the wrong questions to ask. And now there's research to back this up. I was thrilled when it came out. But the right questions to ask are, do I know what my child is doing online? And do I have a good relationship with my child?
Mm,
Because parental controls, which I have a strong negative opinion of, are a game of digital whack-a-mole because I can tell you I have talked to so many parents who have said, I did this, I tried that, I had this app, and my kid found the workaround. Now, if you are listening and you use platforms that work for you, fine. I'm not suggesting you ditch them all, but do not be lulled into a false sense of security
mm,
because more often than not, they don't do what you think they do. And so the only way to protect your children online, if they're spending time online, and most children are, is to talk to them about it and have ongoing conversations, just like the birds and the bees, just real world life skill stuff that we need to be teaching them. We have to have those conversations with them. And that directly connects to the relationship piece.
mhm.
when our teenagers are teenagers, it is normal for them to not like our rules, to eye roll, to call us terrible names. What we forget is that is normal. That is typical adolescent development. What happens is parents often lump that with screen time
Mhm.
or phones, and they think, if it weren't for the phones, my child wouldn't treat me this way. It's
Right.
not true. And so what we have to do is separate, but it's hard to do this, right? It's hard to pull out what's development, what's screen and induce and have that conversation. So I always talk about replacing judgment with curiosity. So we want to avoid the conflict and get to the conversation so that we're approaching this with our child rather than against our child.
Mhm.
And that's hard. Again, I don't do one-off coaching sessions for
Right.
that very reason because it
Right.
isn't a quick fix. I
No,
answered your question in a long way.
no, I appreciate that. I guess one of the things against the parental controls, because some people may think, how do I know my child is being honest with me? At least with the parental control, I have more of a control in place, right? That I can,
Yeah,
or I have that peace of mind that my child isn't going on certain websites or they're not using certain apps, whatever it may
right.
be. But then I can see the downside of that because now everyone has a device, so they may go to their friend's house and
Exactly.
might not be the
Exactly.
parental control. So to your point, if you have that open relationship and you're communicating,
Yes,
then you're ensuring that there's that two-way communication happening. It's like any other thing, right,
exactly.
where you're trying to influence your child not to do certain things. You have to
Exactly.
trust them and have that relationship, right?
Yeah, and the problem with parental controls is I think more often than not, parents are seeking them out as the solution. That if
Mm,
I just do this, then my kid will be fine. If you're a parent who has used them or is using them and talking about it and teaching kids about it, fine. That to me is the best use
mhm,
for that scenario. I just really worry when they are relied upon as this magic solution that they're not. And it does not exempt us from the modeling of the tech use ourselves, like how we use it, and the mentoring, the teaching part of it. That I say to parents, it is not a question of if your child sees porn or violence, it's when. And
mm,
so if you're not having those early conversations, and I'm sorry, but it is true, they have to start at 3, 4, and 5 years old and you don't put it in adult terms. You say there are pictures on the internet that aren't for children. There are people out there who aren't good for kids. You have to have these ongoing conversations. And if you're not ready to do that, they are not ready to have
mhm,
access. And, but to your point, you can do all of that. You can do everything right. You can delay till 16 and then they go to a friend's house and they see it all. So it's almost like we still have, not like, we still have to have those conversations
okay,
even if we have no tech in our house because they're going to get it at school or they're going to get it at a friend's house.
right.
So it's unfortunately that is the landscape we're in. And again, I think the antidote to addiction and problematic use is connection and conversation and trust and transparency. And that's going to come in the form of lots and lots of conversations.
Mhm, absolutely. Yeah, and I guess in isolation, parental controls can just be an arm's length approach to a problem that probably needs a bit more involvement and engagement as you.
Yes,
Another
exactly.
thing that's become very common in schools or adolescents for that matter is ADHD. And unfortunately, from my perspective, medication isn't the solution, but that's the route people are taking. But to your point, I think the relationship piece and all those components you touched on, the connection, the conversation, having that openness can play a huge role in
Yes,
addressing that as well. And devices don't necessarily help within that case too. And that's something I
right.
wanted to highlight.
Actually worked at a center for ADHD and I take a very positive view. A lot of the students I taught at the school I
Mhm,
went to had that diagnosis. One of my own children does. And I see it as a gift. I
mhm,
see it as the as a superpower, right? It's just a different way of seeing the world and experiencing the world. But work and school are typically not set up to embrace that difference. And
yes.
so that is where it becomes really challenging, both on the parent side, the teacher side, and the child side And we know that digital tech, again, because of that neural pathway, right? It taps into that dopamine feedback loop. And for a kid with ADHD diagnoses, like that deep dive, that hyper focus on certain things, it's so easy for the screen to become that. And if you look at there's a Venn diagram of like symptoms of ADHD, and there's different metrics on how you diagnose, but there's that. And then you look at problematic screen use, that Venn diagram is very similar.
Mhm.
And and again, I'm not disputing the reality of a diagnosis, but I'm saying I think it's pretty important to look at the screen time question
Yeah.
as part of addressing that, because I was pretty shocked working at a center for ADHD that we didn't screen kids at all based on their screen, no pun intended, on
Right.
their screen use. It was always conversations about grades and behavior and family life. But if a kid's coming home from school and spending 8 hours playing video games, I think that's going to have an impact on behavior, regardless of a diagnosis. And
Mm.
to me, that has to be part of the conversation. And it used to be that parents were worried about the after school hours. It was like, what's my kid doing when they come home? Now, parents need to know and be aware of the number of hours at school. Kids are playing video games on school district computers, they are watching YouTube videos. So, you again might have a great sense of what's happening in the house, but when your kid goes to school, you have very little awareness or oversight. And again, I'm not even casting schools as all evil in this. I think a lot of times teachers in particular are between a rock and a hard place with what they're being mandated to do and state testing and pressure from some parents actually for more tech, ironically. But to me, that's not what the future skills of a workforce are gonna be, right? Like, the future skills that are gonna set someone up for success are not digital tech skills. Those come later. Any technologist will say that they learned the tech they use today in college or graduate school, not
Right.
kindergarten. And
Yeah.
you can expose kids to things, you can introduce new ideas and concepts and tools, but they need critical thinking skills, they need planning skills and organization, they need to be able to communicate, problem solve. All of that determines future adult success, not what tech you had in second grade.
No, absolutely. And then there's the other piece that I think you touched on briefly when it was early on with Facebook, but now you see it with some of the other social media platforms, whether TikTok or Instagram. I had an individual who deals with a lot of depression amongst kids. And one of the things that is the root cause there is social media use, right? So,
Yes.
especially girls, teenage girls, that's
Yes.
a huge issue when it comes to Instagram or TikTok. And then the other
Yep.
piece there is the bullying piece where, again, growing
Yes.
up, if you were bullied, it was isolated, it was at school. But now with
Exactly.
social media, it can follow you around even after school. So then that's causing a lot of issues amongst children and their mental health. So there's that
Yes.
piece as well in terms of how do parents
Yes.
get involved or what can they do to help their children? And then how are they going to manage some of the other symptoms of depression that is becoming, or at least that are coming to the forefront now?
Yes. Yes. And I like to give this anecdote because I think it really illustrates the sort of contradiction that screen time has become. Because I often hear from parents, my kid needs a phone to be safe. That
Mm,
there's some element of, I'm afraid if they get kidnapped, then I can track them, I can see where they are. So Pew Research found last year, they did a survey of, I think it was probably US parents, but their top three parental fears. Number one was youth mental health.
mhm,
Number two was bullying. And number three was kidnapping.
right,
And I talk about this in the context of what is scary versus what is really dangerous.
yeah,
Kidnapping, the third fear, is statistically nil. If you want your kid to be kidnapped, and what parent does, of course, you'd have to have your kid stay outside every day for 750,000 years to be guaranteed of being kidnapped, right?
mm,
That's how unlikely it is. And yet, when we give a kid a phone, just in case, we make number one and two worse. Youth
right,
mental health and bullying are directly connected to phone use and social media use.
mm,
And parents, in their attempt to address something they're afraid of that sounds scary, make a situation inadvertently more dangerous.
Mhm.
And why do we think kidnapping is such a scary, awful thing? Because we are consuming 24/7 clickbait media
Yeah.
and social media stories that reinforce that fear, which is, to your work, an important adult skill for us to be addressing about our own anxiety about the world. And like dialing down the temperature so that we don't fall into this trap of
Yeah.
thinking things are worse than they are.
Yeah. I think I've touched on this before, and this was something that again came to the forefront during the pandemic where people were searching things and coming up with theories in their head, and then the algorithms are designed to feed you what you're looking for, right?
Exactly.
Reinforcing yourself. And unfortunately, because we weren't having social interactions, we didn't have other people challenging us, or that critical
Exactly.
going away. And that's a huge issue. The other
Yes.
piece I wanted to highlight, and I know we chatted about it offline, was Jonathan Haidt's work. And one of the things, before I asked those questions, you were touching on how these platforms work. And what I really liked was his analogy of the casino, right? The casino is
Yes. The
designed to
slot
keep you,
machine.
yeah,
Yes. Yeah.
everything dark, keeps you inside. And that's what these platforms are doing, right?
Yes.
Whether you're a child or an adult, they are designed to keep you on their platform. They don't want you to leave. It's all advertised based, and that's how their revenue models are set up.
Yes.
So that's just something to keep in mind. When I heard that analogy, I was like, wow, that's true. And it's scary at the same time when you start thinking about it that way.
Yes.
And then the other thing he touched on was certain age parameters when it comes to phones and social media use. So his advice was, don't let your children have smartphones before they're in high school, and then limit their social media use or completely avoid it if you can until they're the age of 16. Now, what are your thoughts on that? Because I know you again,
Yeah.
it's very prescriptive, but how do you follow that? And then the other thing I want to touch on that is, 'cause as a parent, when I hear that, immediately, our tendency is to start shaming ourselves and saying, "Well, I'm
Yes.
doing that, or I missed the boat, or I didn't do that with
Yeah.
my child, or how do I influence that now?" So
Yes.
you
Yes.
tell me.
Great questions. And I will say I'm a big fan of Haidt's work. I quote him in my book. I've been following his research for many years. And I agree with everything he's saying. And he does meticulous work to back up his claims with research, which I appreciate.
Mhm,
And saying that is not as easy as doing that. And that
mhm,
is to your point that what if you're a parent who's hearing this and your kids had a phone for 4 years? What, you're going to feel terrible about yourself. And again, I take a judgment-free approach. I
mhm,
come as you are. If your kid is 18 and about to leave the house and you feel like you've missed this completely, it's not too late. You have a different type of relationship with your kid now than you did before. It is never too late to be impactful. Your kids will still need you and look to you for guidance if you have a good relationship with them. I think the way I freeze my TLDR of my approach is it's supportive of what he's saying, but I phrase it without the ages. So I say later is better, less is more, and relationships first.
mhm,
And are there some kids at 14 who can handle social media and be just fine? Yeah. But most of them can't because of the brain. And also just the time suck alone. Even if they can handle it, they're spending so much time on it that it displaces other things. That's a problem. The other thing that he says that I actually really appreciate and I agree with is this need for collective action, that it has to come from multiple parents in order to make a meaningful change. And I think he cites it in the book, but this study about they asked how much would I have to pay you to give up your phone?
right.
And people had various numbers, but when they said, "I'll pay they said, "If you pay I will pay you to give up my phone if you get everybody to give it up," right? This idea that I don't wanna give it up if I'm the only one, but I'll give it up if everyone gives it up. And
Mm,
to me, that's a no-brainer. That's where this parent conversation has to start in elementary school because we're looking at 30% of 8-year-olds have iPhones at this point. And so it's how do we start those conversations as early as possible to delay as long as possible as a group? Because sometimes it doesn't even have to be a 50%, even if there's a handful, but that's not what's happening right now.
Right.
We're seeing kids with devices at younger and younger ages. And
Yeah.
and I include smartwatches in this. I just want to make a side note about
Yep.
that. I get a lot of parents will say, "Oh, well, you don't do phones, no phones at all," but then she has an Apple Watch. And quite frankly, I feel like it's just as problematic, maybe slightly less, but it's actually on your body. Like you're never away from it. So there's that constant need to touch and tap, and kids are fidgety. And so I just feel like we've gotta give them as much opportunity to not be surveilled by us, to
Mhm.
be out and independent. It used to be that kids would go to school, parents would have no idea what was going on all day
Right.
long. That is so important for child development and parent development, right? We need to trust teachers to take care of the kids. We need to trust our kids that they can take care of themselves. The number of parents who tell me that they text their kids at school, that has to stop. I'm going to be real blunt about that. Parents don't text your kids at school. Email the teacher, email the front office, call the front office, but don't text them at school because
Yeah.
it's disruptive to them and anyone else around them.
Right.
Right. And again, there's that collective action. Like we as parents definitely have some work to do.
Yeah, and in that kind of research finding, what you shared and it comes to the forefront for me is this whole sense of FOMO, right? And that's
Yes.
essentially what it is, right? We want to be
Yeah.
connected, we don't want to miss out. And now you're seeing that come in at a very early age, which
Yes.
again is problematic. The other piece around perhaps I don't want to call it helicopter parenting, but sometimes it can be that when it's to an extreme. But again, from the development side, if you're not building secure attachment and you're creating
Yeah.
the anxious attachment between you and your child, or where they also get anxious when they're away from you, that's not good for their healthy development. And it,
Right.
back to the whole resilience piece we touched on early,
Yeah.
you want your child to go out there and explore because that's what
Yeah.
children did in previous generation. Go out,
Yeah.
explore, form other relationships, figure this world out, and then they know they can come home and have that secure attachment that their parents are gonna be there. That
Yes.
constant need
Yes.
to be in contact and communication, yeah, that I could see a lot of problems with that for sure.
Yeah. And I wrote about this a lot too, because I definitely grew up more in that helicopter parent generation. And actually, the phrase now that's been used is snowplow parent or lawnmower parent. And they're the ones that go ahead of their children to mow away obstacles. So they never experience adversity, which is a little bit different than like the drop in and rescue. And but they're both problematic, right? Because they rob children of an opportunity to struggle. You know,
Mhm.
if we, and I know that intentions are good, right? This is where I take as much of a non judgmental approach as possible because it's like, I know parents think they're doing the right thing, that this is best for my kid. But what if best for your kid is letting them have that logical consequence of forgetting their lunch or, getting a B on a paper or whatever it is that feels like a big deal to them? Said you're giving them these life skills experiences that really will create that resilient adult down the road. And that again, as adults consuming this 24/7 clickbait, it's really hard to see that because we think things are so much worse and we think we have to protect or that what we're doing is protecting, even though
Mhm.
it's paradoxically not.
I think there's a primal aspect to it based on what you're sharing because we obviously evolved because we had the fear response at times, but now it's become too much, right? It's that
Yes.
constant stimulation and walking around in fear, and that's where you see a lot of people experiencing anxiety and struggling because then
Yeah.
it becomes addictive. That whole feeling becomes
Yeah.
addictive, and being in that fight or flight is
Yes.
what people
Yes.
built as a default, and that's where I think a lot of the problems arise too, and then, unfortunately, we pass it on to our children, and
Right.
they don't have the skills. I think there's something to be said about just being out there and figuring things out on your own, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. And modeling that as parents, I would love to see this parenting generation shifting into I think the upside of all of the mental health crisis is that we're talking about mental health, and that's a good thing. I also think as parents, we have some opportunities to really model that we're imperfect and that's okay. And that we're learning and we might make different decisions and change how we used to do things. And what a valuable lesson for these kids growing up who are in this highly anxious state. And I think I was just thinking about, the FOMO you mentioned about, especially for young girls, but it's different for boys too. But that I hear that from parents who take on the FOMO that if I don't give my kid this phone, then they're left out and I don't want my child to be left out. And
Mm.
like, again, I say this with a lowercase t trauma. Like, I want kids aren't going to get through childhood without a little bit of trauma. The bumps and the bruises that build up resilient
Yeah.
children. And so FOMO is part of that. And
Right.
I'll say to parents, like, you can give them a phone, but if you think the FOMO's bad without it, wait till they get a phone. Now they're going to see everything they're left out of. Now
Yeah.
they're going to get screenshots of text messages about how awful people think they are. So don't be under the impression that it's going to go away just because
Mhm.
you've decided to give the phone. It's not going to happen. But I think there are some interim solutions. While we're waiting for collective action, I think one thing that I have found, this is a little non-traditional, is I've shared a phone with my daughter
Mm.
starting at about 11 to 13. She's just turned 13. So I have an iPhone. We have a family iPad. She just gave her friends my phone number. They didn't ask. And thankfully, this is what made this a lot easier. There's a no phone policy at her school. That makes my parenting job 100% easier because I don't have to worry about her going and being the one without the phone, right? No
Right.
one has one or is supposed to have.
Mhm.
And so she just gave them all the number. And then we've had some incredible teaching opportunities come up with group chats and screenshotting and what you say in texts lives forever. And it's been a teachable experience for both of us.
Yeah.
We've also baby stepped it a little bit with some early social media. There's like Zoomerang and Be Real, which are sort of the tween versions of the big ones. And they are not without their problems, even if they're simplified versions, and because we're doing it together, we're having this is working for us. It's not something that again, it's not a one size fits all. Not all
Right.
families will find this pleasant or good, and it isn't, but it has allowed us to delay. So she's 13 and now has a minimalist phone, a light phone it's called, and
Yeah.
it's just texting and calling, and she can download some music, and that's it. And honestly, if what I want because this is the other question we have to ask as parents is for whom am I giving this
Right.
device? It's not for the child 99% of the time. I mean, we might say it is because we don't want him to be left out, but it's for my convenience. So
Mhm.
if what I want is her to be able to call me from, say, I'm taking the bus to a friend's house, great. That's all she needs is
Yeah.
something that literally calls and texts.
Yeah.
But not a lot of parents are choosing that path yet.
Yeah.
We'll get there.
Yeah, yeah, no, and I think that's a great point, like, it doesn't have to be a full-fledged smartphone that the child needs, right? If it's
No.
really more contact or making sure parents are aware of what's going on, then, yeah, it could be a simplified
Yes.
version without being able to access the internet and going down a whole
Yes.
path of trouble potentially. The other
Yes.
piece there, coming back to the whole collective action and what you touched on there with your daughter's school, I think there's something to be said about that too, that when we're talking collective, this isn't only the families, but the school also playing a role, the community playing a role,
Yes.
and then to a larger extent, society playing a role around what can these norms be. So then there's consistency, right? And I think one of the
Yes.
problems is, to your point and everything you've touched on, is you could have certain boundaries and certain rules at home, but then when you go to school, everyone's coming in with their own
Yep.
boundaries from home, which could be porous, and there could be certain situations where there are no boundaries. So then there's
Exactly.
no consistency there, and the school then doesn't really do play a role. Then everyone it's a free for all. So I think
Yes.
there's certain specifications and rules and boundaries with respect to the school, and then that's being fed back to the parents and the parents are involved, I think there could be a lot of positive movement from that can truly help this situation.
I agree. And again, as a former teacher, I have a lot of empathy for what teachers are going through. I cannot imagine being in a classroom right now and trying to manage not only just normal seventh grade behavior, but 30 kids with smartphones at the
Yeah.
same time, right? It, teaching is fundamentally changed because of this. And I really believe it has to be ideally a district-wide policy, not just a school-wide policy, and if it's either one of them, it has to be clear and enforced across the board. It has to include rules about teacher devices because those are often problematic or teachers are on their devices during the day. It's a thorny situation, and people don't wanna be told that they can't have their device, and I will say there are a few exceptions here, that there are kids for whom a tech-based tool might be a medical device, or in certain specific cases, a learning tool. Like I'm thinking of a nonverbal autistic child, for example, who might use an iPad to communicate. To me, those are the obvious exceptions. Of course, you would give that to a
Mhm.
child who needed it, but you don't need to give it to the whole class. It's just because one child needs eyeglasses doesn't mean the whole class should have
Yeah,
eyeglasses. It's
sure.
just bonkers to me that we've decided. I say this all the time, like kids are not standardized and we're trying to standardize them by giving them all the same computer, the same curriculum. And that's not how it works. If
Yeah.
you know anything about children and teaching and learning, that is just not how it happens. And
Yeah.
that's a lot of the advocacy work I do is actually around pushing back. Like, why are we letting technologists dictate what teachers do? And
Right.
teachers are the experts of their craft. I don't walk into a surgery operating room and tell the surgeon how to operate. That's not my wheelhouse. So unfortunately, teachers are undervalued and underappreciated in many
Yeah.
ways, and not just around this, but that's an important distinction in this advocacy, I think.
For sure. And it's not helping them with their jobs either, right? With all this
Oh,
technological influence. The
no.
the other piece you touched on, and when we were talking about social media use, so I think we can get behind the whole phone piece and trying to delay it as much as possible with certain restrictions and limitations. But everything about social media we've talked about thus far, and as I've had a lot of conversations with people my own age, and myself included, I've reflected on my relationship with social media.
Mhm.
I definitely see a lot more negatives than positives. In fact,
Yes.
I'm at a point where I don't see a lot of positives, to be honest. And I've had very similar conversations with friends. So knowing all the risks, knowing everything we know now about social media and how it's working and how these platforms are potentially even attacking people in one way or preying on certain people,
Yeah.
how do you manage or how do we collectively manage the social media use for children? And is it something we should just completely avoid? And then through that collective work that you touched on, is that something
Yeah.
we keep for then?
That's a great question. And there's a lot of different possible solutions. And I think they're going to have to come at different levels, whether it's legislation or litigation or policy or parenting or education. I think all of it needs to happen. So, one of the challenges, of course, is that technology moves very quickly
Mhm.
and policy and law move very slowly. And
Mhm.
it's going to take a lot of time before law will catch up, if ever, to technology. So, in the meantime, we have to attack it at different angles. I know there's a lot of different state and local policies and laws being proposed about social media bans or not allowing TikTok in some states. And I see that a lot as digital whack-a-mole, that game where you're just trying to knock one thing out. And the problem is it's just always going to be an alternative to pop
Mhm.
up in its place. And so what I think is more effective and what's more complex to do, but is to push back on the business model of big
Mhm.
technology companies and small ones and say that you can't use manipulative design techniques and you can't profit off of minors' data because that's what's happening. they're certainly profiting off of our data, but at least we're consenting adults theoretically. And so that's where I see the change needing to come because they put profit before people. And it is a technological future we're looking at. And I think it can be a more humane one when we hold companies accountable. And that's hard. It's a pretty lucrative industry. It's hard to get people to say, oh, yeah, you're right. I should care about people and just make less money.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, not the reality. We're
Like the tobacco industry.
exactly. And it took litigation to change. You do see there are some parallels there. The difference is, I talk about this a lot with people, like, how is it like big tobacco? And the difference is we weren't giving kids cigarettes. But yeah, there was the teenagers that might have done some smoking, but we weren't handing 5-year-old cigarettes and we are handing 5-year-old iPads.
Yeah.
So it's a little tricky.
Yes, absolutely. And I agree. And I think the biggest challenge with that too, as you were sharing that, is if, as adults, we don't know there's something wrong and something bad and how it's impacting us, then how can we influence our children? And
Exactly.
that's where I think it becomes even more complex. And as I shared earlier, I've had to really intentionally reflect on my relationship with social media and the usage. And it took me a really long time to get there. If you're not doing that, then how do you recognize it? And then how can you then influence the child or play a significant role in how they're using it? And to your point earlier, have that relationship where you're even communicating about all these risks.
Yeah.
And again, as we all know, brain development doesn't take place so much later in life, at least until 25. It's a
Right.
long road ahead for
Right.
children and their use with respect to some of these platforms.
And the reality is, children are going to grow up and be the kind of adults they see from the adults around them. So their parents or their teachers. And so if you are proud of the way that you use digital tech around your kids and you're fine with them growing up and doing the same thing, maybe there's not much here for you. But chances are, I think most of us could say, yeah, I could stand to change a few things. And
Mhm.
habit change is hard, as I'm sure you are well aware. And one thing I do when I survey parent communities before I do school presentations, I ask the question, how many of you have a phone in your room at night? And
Mhm.
I've been doing this for 5 or 6 years now, and the number has gone up every year, but we're looking at 95 to 98% of parents who have their phones in their room at night, and 10% of them have them on their bed, in or on their bed. And
Mm.
I'm happy to be in that 3% who doesn't. And it's been something we've been very intentional about, is that doesn't mean I don't have my phone in my room sometimes, but I put it in the kitchen, plugged in before I go to bed at night. Because when my 16-year-old is going to bed and I'm saying, remember, put your phone in the kitchen, he
Mhm.
doesn't say to me, well, that's not fair. You don't have to, right?
Right.
We don't think about it when our kids are little. We're not thinking about my 3 and 6-year-old giving me that, but it's modeling. I'm saying I'm not going to let the phone interfere with my sleep or my doom scrolling before bed. I'm going to be intentional, and we can baby step it. I think even small changes have big impact. So put your phone outside in the hallway to the
Mhm.
other side of your room. Even just wean yourself by foot to make that, to break up with your phone at night, and that's good for you as an adult. And there's others like hacks, and I'm not the only one to talk about it, but you can turn your phone to grayscale and you can
Yep.
turn off all your notifications. I did that. I will tell you, I never miss a text message because the sad reality is my phone's never that far away, but it doesn't make a noise when I get one.
Yeah.
I'm not distracted or pulled away. My focus isn't shifted. These are adult changes that we can
Mhm.
do that can have big benefits for how we parent and how we show up around even our peers, our friends, our colleagues. And
Yeah.
yeah, I'm a big fan of that. And my favorite tip to give, which is just broad for all of us, is this concept of living your life out loud, which really just means narrating what you do as you do it. So I'm reaching for my phone. I'm going to check and see what time dinner plans are and what restaurant. And then I'm going to look at Google Maps and see how long it takes me to get there. And do I need an umbrella? The play by
Yeah.
play of how we use it. And again, I'm talking about adults, like parents doing it.
Yeah.
And there's so many benefits, right? You're modeling, you're talking about how this is a multi-tool, not a Swiss Army knife, or it's a Swiss Army knife, not a switchblade, is what I usually say. And I can also start to attach the emotional piece. I can say, oh gosh, I feel so bored and I'm reaching for Instagram and I'm scrolling and I don't feel better just looking at all these pictures. Like now I feel worse about myself. Like
Mm.
these are all valuable things for our children to see and witness because it helps them understand the complexity of this issue.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And one of the things I wanted to touch on throughout the episode was like the feeling you have when you forget your phone, right?
Yeah.
And the anxiety that comes with it because our whole lives are in those devices. So it is pretty
Wellness.
scary when you think about it. But I do appreciate some of those tools. I know I use the sleep mode, which really helps because then I'm not responding to text messages or phone calls a couple
Yeah.
hours before I'm going to bed. So I
Yeah.
try and wean myself off before I go to sleep too, because that affects our sleep as well. But yeah, no, this has been great. Thank you so much, Emily, for sharing so much and your wisdom and insight. And I hope the listeners also can benefit from this. And the biggest piece, for anyone struggling with this as an adult or even trying to manage it for their children is what you touched on, having that curiosity and not looking at more with judgment, right? Just being
Yeah.
curious and trying to work with your child. And I think the biggest thing we can all do is to have that collective approach because that's what's going to get us out of it.
Relationship to our children and to each other. Absolutely. I agree. Thank you
Yeah.
for having me. It's been a great conversation. I really
Yeah,
appreciate it.
absolutely. And for listeners that do want to get a hold of you, find your work, what are some ways they can do that?
I have a website, thescreentimeconsultant.com, and I have a book called The Screen Time Solution, a judgment-free guide to becoming a tech intentional family. That's
Mm.
available anywhere books are sold. I always put in a plug for independent stores. You can go in and request, and they'll be able to get it for you. And I actually write weekly essays. So if parents are interested, or not just parents, anyone, to sign up for my mailing list, and I just send weekly essays about whatever topic is hot in the news or something that happened as a parent or thoughts about teaching and education. And I've gotten positive feedback that those are the kind of newsletters people want to open.
Yeah. Sure.
Okay. So, and of
Sure.
course, I'm on social media. I have some assistants that help me, so I don't have to spend all my time there, but
Yeah.
I do have a presence online as well. So
Great.
find me
We'll put
there.
that in the show notes. But thank you again, Emily. This was a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.